Hello everyone, hope doing well. Today we are back in War Thunder looking at another user mission and a user custom model once again made by Z Peregrine. Now if you don't remember who Z Peregrine is, he's the guy behind the Fokker G1, which we looked at maybe a month ago or so at this point. Now he has come back with another machine, which is the Fokker T5, which is kind of a bomber version of kind of the same specification, but we'll get into the history of that in a little bit. I just want to say, when it comes to independent creators like Z Peregrine, I'm very thankful for the work that they do in War Thunder. Like, I know how much effort it takes to put into a project like this, and all I can say really is thank you. Thank you for the work that you do, and I hope that you continue with this work. It is appreciated. I understand that sometimes it may not feel appreciated, but just understand it is. Now, if you guys want to try this for yourself, there will be a link in the description below, and also I'll leave a link to the Fokker G1 as well, which is more of the lighter and deadlier version, I suppose you'd say, of the Fokker T5. So let's get into the history of this, and then we'll get into where will its place be in War Thunder. So the Fokker T5 bomber was the only real bomber plane of the Dutch Air Force in May 1940. It had not been intended as a genuine bomber though. When its initial design started in 1936, it was emphasized that they wanted to design a light fighter cruiser and a heavy fighter cruiser. Now, as we talked about, the Fokker G1 was seen as the light fighter cruiser, and this was seen as the heavy fighter cruiser, the Fokker T5. But because of its rigidness, and because of the fact that it didn't exactly fly so well, it was designated a medium bomber as well instead of a fighter cruiser. Now, what is a fighter cruiser in this context? Well, a fighter cruiser in 1936 would be, 1936 to 1940 in Holland, where this is from, would be a fighter bomber aircraft. So kind of what the Typhoon morphed into, during the war, and then what the Hurricane also morphed into. I know a lot of people talked last time about how I was unfair about the Hurricane and Typhoon, calling them more attacker aircraft in previous videos. I understand that they were designed with the idea of being a fighter behind them, but the majority of the time during the war they were relegated to inferior roles, or at least that's how it was seen. So I see them much more as fighter bombers, whereas the specifications here for these two aircraft were for fighter bombers. Now, just as a little tidbit, if you ever see any more Fokker aircraft or just want to kind of get some of the nomenclature behind everything, so the Fokker had 4 different types of aircraft, or at least 4 different names or designations for aircraft. You had the T, this stood for bomber, G, which stood for fighter cruiser, D, which stood for fighter, and C for reconnaissance. So let's say you see like a Fokker a Fokker like 500D or something, right? That's a name that you see. Well, this would be a fighter. Now, if it was a G, it would be seen as a fighter cruiser, and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of information, just in case you run into this company again. So let's go into the history, where this came from, why it appeared, the issues that it had, and why it didn't have too much of an effect. So in May of 1936, funds were made available to design and build a prototype for some new military airplanes for the Dutch Air Force. At the time, let's just say they didn't have a lot going for them when it came to modern planes. The most modern operational Dutch plane which was able to deliver bombs, it was the CX biplane, which was seen as a design from a previous generation of planes. So it had very basic bomb racks under the wings. It was also a biplane, and in 1936 I understand a lot of nations still used biplanes, but they were definitely moving into the monoplane stage when you look at certain designs which were around the place. So therefore while this was going on, there was a bunch of meetings, and it was decided that Fokker would be awarded the contract because the government wanted an indigenous design and production. Fokker being the largest, or one of the largest companies at the time, which was also indigenous, they wanted to go straight for them. So they created an order for the T5, which was a whole new principle of bomber design at the time for the Dutch. So because this was a new idea or a new principle, they decided that they were going to do a ton of meetings to try and work out exactly what they wanted out of this design. So during these meetings, there was 124 of them in total. They discussed design philosophy, they discussed demands, they discussed what they wanted to do basically with it. And these meetings were held between the Fokker design department, military purchasers, and also some members of the government. So the demands which were put in front of the Fokker designers was that they wanted a variety of payloads. They wanted them to be required and to carry 23 different configurations of bomb loads. Now, just think about that. 23 different configurations. That may not sound a lot, but just think about if you have like 4 bombs. So do 23 to the power of 4. Then you realize how of a dodgy aspect this could be, trying to create a bomb bay for this. They also wanted 1,200 kilos to be the maximum bomb load at the time. So there's also that problem on top of it. So 1,200 kilos in 23 different configurations. Not exactly fun. So because of this, they saw it as a ridiculous demand, but because they didn't want to say no, they wanted to keep the contract and everything like that, Fokker decided to leave the design of the bomb bay and the bomb hatches undefined after these 124 meetings. So the discussions dragged on until October 1936. And so we're talking from May 1936, so we're talking May, June, July, August, September, October, about 7 months here, maybe 6 if you want to be generous, and there was no progress of actual construction of a prototype or anything like that. So the Chief of the General Staff, who was General Reinders, and I apologize if I say anything wrong in this video, but General Reinders, he decided that he was going to go to the Ministry of Defense and basically talk about how ridiculous this all was. There was problems with the purchasing department. They were getting in the way of his construction progress. He did not want to try and convince people that it needed to be built. He just wanted it to be built. And to be quite honest, I can kind of see where he's coming from at this point. Like, there are times where you do want to sit in a meeting, you do want to sit in a hall, try and lay everything out, make sure everything is ready, but there are some times where you just go, just do it, let's get it done, let's go down and let's make it, let's see what happens, stop, cogitating, let's go. So obviously the general was not amused with the delay of the T5 itself, but he also expressed his great concern about the slow progress of the Air Force expansion in general. Remember, at this time, they are still using previous generation's planes, which is not good. He demanded that the defense purchasers would source suitable planes, so fighters and dedicated bombers abroad, and he predicted that modern warfare could not survive without the availability of plenty of modern dedicated bombers. So this guy was, on his brain. He knew exactly what was going on, he knew exactly what was going to happen. But obviously, the problem with this is that he lacked any confidence in the Dutch indigenous industry to fill the gaps in the lines that he saw, and his appeal was in vain, and his words were hardly heard. So kind of not really the canary in the coal mine, but more of the person who is correct but is seen as just a crazy person, so therefore not regarded, which is kind of sad, because if they'd listened to him, I mean, maybe at the time of October 1936 there's nothing that anybody could have done about it, but at least it could have been acknowledged as an issue. So the initial intention for the Fokker T5 was there was going to be 48 of them, which would form 3 squadrons of 16 planes each, and it was later decided that the planes would be designed and equipped as medium bombers. So in January of 1937, the Ministry of Defense, they ordered the first 16 T5s, and at this point they wanted 2 follow-up orders of the next 32 T5s which were scheduled, and this was notwithstanding the previously addressed written plea by General Reynders, the Ministry of Defense, and even though that happened, they cut the budget for these squadrons early in 1938, which resulted in the cancellation of any plans to order the other 32 planes. So they were stuck with 16 after the cancellation of the others. Money was just seen as needed elsewhere, and the bombers were considered less important than other weaponry. So even though, General Reynders had this plea, and remember, General Reynders was the chief of the General Staff, he was overruled by the Minister of Defense, or the Secretary of Defense, who just completely disagreed with him. So you can fault them for this project not going further. Now, since we have 16 which are ordered, the problem with this is they haven't even made one yet. So the first one that they made was a flying mock-up, which was based on what the military purchasers would decide, and would decide on the final internal configuration of the other 15 planes. So it's pretty much a prototype at this stage. And the odd thing about this is not really how you do stuff. So they sat around for 6 to 7 months trying to work out what they wanted, and then they built a plane on top of the idea that they weren't sure still what they wanted, and then from there they would decide, from changing the plane after it was made, then they would decide what the next 15 would look like. It just seems completely crazy to me. It's kind of the opposite way that you do stuff. But anyway, so they ordered a production series of planes without even testing the flying prototype, and as you can see, this is normally not a great idea. So this meant that Fokker was posed with all kinds of design queries that had to be answered during the production and the trials of it, and the bomb bay compartment was improvised, which was awaiting a final decision on the type, shape and weight of the bombs. Now, something to actually mention as well is the 23 different configurations of bombs which were required. There were bombs listed in these 23 configurations which didn't exist at the time. So they wanted to future plan or future proof this aircraft to be able to carry bombs which didn't even exist. Now remember, this is a design where they haven't even properly worked out all the components yet, they haven't built it yet, but they are now wanting to design a bomb bay for bombs that they have no idea what they'll look like, and they have no idea if they will exist or not. Do you see a bit of a problem here? So anyway, Fokker went on, and they decided that after creating the prototype they needed to make a bomb rack. So that was something that had to be done. So the Dutch themselves didn't produce any type of suitable bomb rack, so for the time being they went to a German rack made by Herber, or Heber, I'm not exactly sure how you say it. So this was selected for the first 2 planes, and the nose section also awaited a final decision on the type of nose gun. Eventually it would actually be a 20mm, the 20mm Solothurn gun, I believe it is. I'm not exactly sure who makes that. I'm guessing it's some company named very close to Solothurn. But anyway, let's go into the bomb bay, because the bomb bay is a story in itself. So the bomb rack, it was an interesting and extended discussion again. So Fokker decided after, Heber had created the first few racks, they wanted to go to a Dutch company called Van Heist to design a bomb rack suitable for the T5 bomb bay, and Van Heist had previously delivered the bomb racks for the CX, so they at least had created some before. What you may not know is these that they created before for the CX, let's just say they had a bunch of problems with its gas cartridge release mechanism. So at the same time, Heber remained in contact with Fokker and stated they would be able to design a suitable tailor-made rack based on an electromagnetic release mechanism. So Van Heist continued to redesign the new racks, but time and again failed to meet the requirements. So once again, a bit of a botched job. And then the design was made to order two Heber racks. I'm going to say is Heber, basically, and build the other racks in license. So this decision came too late for the bombers to be equipped with the efficient German racks in May 1940, and in the end, at the 10th of May 1940, 2 of the T5 bombers were equipped with the Heber racks, whilst the other 14 planes had all racks of civil KLM planes, and these were installed. So it would have serious consequences for the payload of the T5s that were, as such, only able to drop 400 to 600 kilos instead of the 1200 kilos that was wanted. So the Van Heist company, even though they're indigenous to Holland, they failed, and therefore others had to be seen. Heber was gone for. Unfortunately, they didn't arrive in time, so basically you had already underbombed Fokker T5s, and obviously these crazy configurations, there was no way they were going to be able to deliver on them. So in September 1937, when the prototype was towed out of the Fokker hangar, in October, it would make its maiden flight. So the plane was designated the 850, and every plane after that would have the numbers, 51, 52, 53, and so on. And it was equipped with 2 Bristol Pegasus 20 engines. So you're looking at British engines here. Now, the idea was, even though this prototype used the Pegasus 20s, that they had a contract which stated that the Pegasus 26 engines would actually be built in. So even though this prototype had the 20s, all the rest would have the more advanced engines. But they weren't available yet, and the other planes would indeed be equipped with them. So an extended discussion then started about the camouflage colours and pattern, and it wasn't before February 1938 before the 850 was shown with the final painting finish. So there was numerous small changes to the design followed, after which the plane was 90% ready in June 1938, and it only failed the final nose section because the nose gun had not been selected yet. So by pretty much 1938, the end of 1930, well, sorry, the middle of 1938, June of 38, this thing is ready to rock, or at least the prototype is. So it's taken us about 2 years and a bit to get to this point, which is a long time. And when you actually look at other countries, like I suppose when you look at France with their tank production, it's actually not that long of a time. But if you know that war is coming, if you can see it on the horizon, especially in 1938, you would feel that this process would have been a little bit faster. For me, when I read about it, it reads exactly like too many cooks in the kitchen, or too many hands in the cookie jar. Basically, too many people trying to put their fingers in the pie instead of making the pie itself. And this is a problem that a lot of designs have, over the years. So it just seems like it failed because of that. Anyway, so the 851, 852, and 853, they left the production hall after the prototype was seen as ready in June 1938, and the delivered plane still had to go through a series of adaptations. So even though they were now on the main production line of the 15 aircraft, they still had to add stuff in. So camera positions, communications instruments, adjustments to the rudder, all of these things. So the plane is still not ready to go. It is still not ready to be fully produced. And it was proved. One of the interesting things about these three was it gave them a good comparison to show between the Pegasus 20 engines and the Pegasus 26 engines. And the 20 engines actually outperformed the 26 engines. So the reason was later determined that the two-pitch propeller mode of the 20 rather than the auto pitch of the 26 was just much better. So this is kind of surprising. They pretty much ordered the wrong engines, I think is the best way of putting it. So even though on top of this, so after the prototype and then the three are made, these planes were accepted into the Air Force, they had a few issues. So on top of all of the issues with the design, on top of all the issues with everything else going on, they had an incredibly vulnerable hydraulic system. So pressure vessels, hydraulic piping, these all presented all kinds of challenges to the designers and constructors, and all kinds of troubles were experienced with the T5. So these were obviously exemplified by the fact that there was no spare parts because of the late selection of the final plane design. They had not time to actually make spare parts for the thing. And so then at the end of the test trials, it was finalized with the 7th plane delivered, the 856. It was September 1939. So it's taken them to finally come up with the design that they are happy with. 3.5 years. Now you could be generous and say 3 years, but from the point at which the prototype or the mock-up was made in September 1937, it took them 2 whole years before they were happy with the design in 1939. So 2 whole years, which is kind of crazy. But even then, once they'd finalized the design, after the 7th plane, remember, only out of 16, so you've only got 9 planes to go at this point of the first order, the issues were still there with the hydraulic system. So the delivered planes, they all had to be replaced because the selected French product failed completely in the planes. So the gear hydraulics posed problems, and as such, on many occasions, the crew had to use manual pump to lower the wheels. So we're talking about the systems which are designed to lower the wheels for landing. So this thing had so many damn issues which could have all been solved by just picking the correct parts. Then it turned out that the oil consumption of the engines was way higher than the Bristol specification. So the problems would never be actually solved with these things, and not even when Bristol themselves got involved, so the people who actually made the Pegasus engines. A third problem was the interference of the radio during operations that would later be determined as caused by the engine sparks of all things. So a problem that today is well known and solved by isolating the engines, but in those days it was pretty new, so at least that could be seen as, acceptable. The other two, not so much. So just before war broke out, the problem was solved. But the other two weren't. The two major ones which actually put the crew in danger. And one of the things that you don't want as an aircraft or an airplane is to actually put the people inside it in danger. So because of the oil consumption issues, because of the hydraulic issues, the Air Force commanders also had other stuff to actually think about. So there was a massive shortage of trained twin-engine plane pilots and observers. So this shortage was created by the lack of a sufficient number of planes to train the crews. Remember, before this, they were still working on biplanes. There wasn't many twin-engine planes in Holland at the time. This was probably seen as one of the first ones, at least one of the first built by, Holland itself. So, with all of this said, you've created a plane, war is starting to break out, and you don't have anybody to man them, and you have all of these problems with it. Crazy. Anyway, a deal was established for the KLM, and pilots were exchanged, and in the end, many T5 pilots were designated as auxiliary KLM pilots, and as such, yet another problem was solved. So they did fix that problem eventually. The other problems, though, The huge oil consumption made the T5 unsuitable for prolonged fights, and such it was hardly ever used for patrolling the skies during the period of September 39 to May 1940, and during one of the rare patrol flights in April 1940, one of the few T5s, 864, had to make a crash landing and was seriously damaged. The expansion of the hydro oil tanks improved the flight duration, but did not solve the problems with the oil consumption, which is obviously a bit of an issue. So the armament of the T5 was also not addressed yet by this point. Just think about it. It's crazy, you know. So the plane, it was originally designated to become a fighter cruiser, capable of carrying just a small payload of bombs, and it was quite heavily armed for the bomber at the time. What you've got to remember is by 1940, you know, you're talking about stuff like Whitleys, Hamptons, even very early Wellingtons, HU-111s, Ju-88s. We're not talking about crazy heavily armed stuff like the B-17 or the B-29 at this point. So in the end, selected for a nose gun had become the Solothurn 20mm, which was not capable of automatic fire, and it was a man-operated single shotgun, and although it was capable of rapid fire since it had a half automatic action, and then furthermore 3 7.9mm FN machine guns were divided over as many machine gun positions at all angles, so you had top, bottom, rear in the fuselage. So the plane eventually was able to carry its maximum payload of 1200 kilos, which is good, and the bomb aiming device was also delivered short. So this meant that some T5s had no or older aiming devices. Overall, you can see that this thing definitely had a dogged creation, I think it would be. And this is all before any fighting took place. So let's go into how this thing did during the May War. Can you imagine? So on the 10th of May 1940, there was 9 out of the 16 planes which were ready for action. None of the other 7 planes were successfully prepared for action during the May War. So you are already stuck at nearly half of your allotted machines. All these planes, with the exception of one at Texel, were stationed at Schiphol and AFB. So the Fokker T5 was capable medium bomber in 1940. Then if you compare it to other machines such as the Wellington, the Dornier Do-17, the Heinkel 111, the Protest 630, it was seen as pretty good. You know, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It obviously had some limitations with its improvised bomb racks and the huge disadvantage of not being able to go that far without its engines annihilating itself, but overall it was seen as a pretty good medium bomber. So during the May War, it was used as an active tactical bomber, and even though there was hardly any of them, you know, 9 only, it saw some moderate success. They flew quite a bunch of missions. The AFBs of Valhaven and Ockenburg were raided, as well as the bridges in the heart of Rotterdam and at Mjadjik. And in case of the latter, it was the only mission where 300 kilos of bombs were actually used. So, remarkably, the first scramble of the bomber squadron from Schiphol in the first hour of the German invasion, all bombers were scrambled without bombs and with the assignment to assault the Luftwaffe strike planes. So quite a number of bombers and transporters were shot down against 0 own losses, although one plane landed in Zeeland and got heavily damaged during landing on a barricaded runway. So the 20mm was shown as a valuable weapon during these confrontations. So the T5, its most successful actual use, was in the role that it was intended to do, which was the fighter cruiser. But they designed it wholeheartedly to be a medium bomber. This design, you can see its potential, but it just had way too many things go wrong with it by the end of when it was actually used. Now, at the same time, there is another plane, the T9. Now, the T9 bomber was also a prototype bomber, all aluminium, made by Fokker, and it would be nice, I suppose, to see it in the game at some point. But today we're just going to focus on the T5. I think its history is interesting. Since it's from, Holland or the Netherlands, depending on what you want to say, I personally believe that it should be in-game. Where it should be in-game, well, who knows. When I talked about the Fokker G, I said since it was used by, the Dutch and also the Germans, it may be worth putting it as a German premium. I can't find any reference for the T5 being used for any other nation apart from the Dutch, so overall I would probably give it a premium to the British just because it used British engines, but then again it used French guns, so it's kind of a toss-up depending on where you wanted to put it. I personally would put it in the British tree though, just because that seems to be where a lot of these odd nations vehicles end up, and I would love to have another British premium. I definitely want to see it in game though, and once again, well done to Z Peregrine for making this model. I hope you enjoyed the history of this aircraft, and I'll see you next time.